Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 50th week of 2017. I'm Carl Estabrook. For more than a quarter century, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are posted on the blog, newsfromneptune.com. In a inequality and immiseration edition of News from Neptune, we try to bear in mind the murdered Rosa Luxemburg's remark from a century ago, the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. And George Orwell, in the suppressed preface to Animal Farm, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. We have a number of things that probably people do not want to hear to talk about tonight. David, what's on your list?
Well, the one thing, I didn't really do my due diligence this week as much as I should have. I mean, I read, but I didn't make notes. But fortunately, the News Gazette saved me this morning. It could have saved me in any number of ways.
You've done so much for them over time. It's really good.
I have. And with apologies to a decent guy, former Urbana City Council person, Eric Jacobson, I'm going to give him a hard time.
Okay.
He's a nice guy, a decent guy, a good family man, a good physicist, but I'm going to give him a hard time. And the reason I'm going to give him a hard time is that in response to the threat of the tax reform bill to tax the earnings, so-called earnings of graduate students, which has since been rescinded, and I was pretty sure that they weren't going to let this thing go through and impoverish so many graduate students, because there's a lot of relatively privileged and powerful people on the sides of those grad students, and I don't think they were going to see them hurt this way. I mean, graduate students are already exploited enough, and there's really no reason to exploit them anymore. So whether or not the whole tax reform bill goes through seems to be in doubt now, at least a little more in doubt than it was a day or two ago.
Yep.
But this part of it that people, especially for obvious reasons in this community, were so worried about, apparently is just gone. I didn't read how it went gone. I don't know what the background story to that is. I kept looking for things about it on a sort of a daily basis to see, have they said anything about this? But it just seemed like to be in there, then it was gone.
Somebody rushed into the committee room and tore a page out of the bill and rushed out, I think.
Yeah, but again, there are too many vested interests and relatively powerful people, whether they're Republican or not, to sort of let this thing go through, which graduate students are already laying golden eggs for lots of people who make money off their labor and their work. But what Eric Jacobson wrote in opposing this measure, before he may have known, obviously before he may have known, because I'm sure he wrote this several days ago at least, he went into a sort of had a attack of Cold War conventional wisdom that I think is worth repeating, worth reading. He writes, after Sputnik in 1957, we realized as a nation that we needed to ramp up our science and technology workforce. I, meaning Eric Jacobson, was supported by the National Defense Education Act for studies leading to my doctorate in physics in 1969. Based on our enhanced capabilities, I love this, all these we's. We won the Cold War and enhanced our prosperity. our security and well-being. Taxing tuition waivers for graduate students will have the effects of reversing all that we did. It is such a self-destructive thing that it makes me wonder, and just for a little dessert on this, for a little icing on this cake, on this sort of liberal Cold War liberal cake, it is such a self-destructive thing that it makes me wonder whether the Russians have hacked into our legislative process as well as our elections.
His tongue is thoroughly in his cheek here, hey?
I'm not sure. Well, I mean, why does he bring up elections? I mean,
Well,
apparently he's one of those people who just believes, one of those liberal people, Clintonite people who believes that it should be well understood by all reasonable people right now that the Russians hacked into our election process to some effect, to the detriment of Hillary Clinton.
I think it's a good exegetical rule, though, that when someone you respect says something silly, you have to assume they're kidding.
Okay, okay.
I think he might be.
We'll take that lesson as a throwaway line. The rest of it's bad enough.
There we
because it entered, I mean, the whole revision of the Cold War, which has been over for over 25 years now, and we now perfectly well understand that the Russians were never any threat, never any military threat. The fact that the Russians sent up a satellite before we did in the 1950s was just an excuse to kind of gear up our science and technology process, our military process to it was sort of military Keynesianism in the educational sector, is what it was. And a lot of people got a lot of money, a lot of research got funded. Probably some of Noam Chomsky's research got funded.
It was very much so.
In that general
Exactly right.
in that general category of things we have to do to win the Cold War. The Russians were good at their science and technology. They were good for a while at their space travel. A lot of good scientists.
Well, they would have gotten the Americans home from the space station, right?
Yeah, is that what they did?
That's true, yeah.
I forgot about that.
No, just this week or last week, but yeah.
Just last
right.
week. Oh, I thought that was something that happened a while back.
Well, it did happen a while back, but it's happened for a while now that the program has depended upon Russian rocketry.
Oh, really? Yeah. Did we thank them for that? So, just to look at, in case anybody who watches this program reads this and doesn't have all kinds of alarm bells come on as to the fact that this is just a big passel of nonsense, of sort of propagandistic, sort of liberal propagandistic nonsense about education funding and why we needed to fund science research and how that got done and how great we are, and even the fact that progress is being made because of that scientific research, because as I've written before and as I've said before, it just seems that the lower 50% of the population their lives just can't seem to benefit from all this scientific progress. They haven't just figured a way out, as good as and wonderful as we're all supposed to believe this is, they can't seem to get any, their wage seems to be stuck for the last 30 or 40 years at in current value about $15,000, which isn't much for anybody working full time, $15,000 to $20,000. So,
on the program Aware on the Air that we do here at Urbana Public Television on Tuesdays, last week there was a discussion of the Cold War. Came up, I thought, in an interesting way. Our friend Ed Mandel raised the question of fake news, not in terms of what the president said that morning or what had happened that week, but the notion that the Cold War, this wasn't quite Ed's view, but this is the way the discussion developed, the Cold War was itself fake news from the beginning to end. You alluded to that by saying that the whole story of Russia or the Soviet Union about to descend on Western Europe or about to take Connecticut or to do something really nasty that meant the U.S. had to build up this tremendous military establishment in the 1950s, that's all nonsense. It was all a lie. It was a lie from the beginning. It was a lie semi-engineered by the American ruling class that knew that the Depression had ended only because of war production. And with the war being over, the Depression was coming back. And the only way to stop the Depression from coming back was to gin up a new war.
Yeah.
And to look around, they see the exhausted Soviet Union, which had defeated Nazi Germany. We didn't do it, the Soviet Union did, and lost 27 million people. We lost about 500,000. And they looked at the exhausted Soviet Union and said, oh, these guys are dangerous. We have to build up a military establishment as big as we had during the war, during the Second World War, to counter the tremendous threat from the Soviet Union. It was all nonsense. It was all a lie. It was, in the current phrase, fake news. And like all fake news, it was done for a purpose. It wasn't just an accident. We didn't just get it wrong. Oh, shucks, we thought they were dangerous, but they weren't. No, it was a conscious, calculated plan by the American ascendancy to control both the domestic economy and the world economy militarily. That's what the Cold War was, and it depended upon fake news.
So let's get over. I mean, I get tired of the sort of self-congratulatory attitude in academia, as if everything is that's I know that's nothing new, but and I mean there's a lot
like
to
getting
be
tired of ice at the North Pole, right?
There's a lot to be proud of in terms of the research that's done here, that has been historically done here, and people. They earn their Nobel Prizes by doing obviously really important and path-breaking work. But how that gets applied socially, politically, is a very different story. How those discoveries play, whether in relation to medicine or physics or solid state or anything else, or computer technology, how that plays out socially. Is something different, and the problem, generally speaking, is that as we read these ongoing economic data reports about inequality in income and wealth. A recent one just came out. A recent global inequality report just came out today, or the other day, by Piketty and his growing research team that's got like 25, 30 people on it now, and talking about how inequality has increased globally, not just in this country, but comparing them. And what I wanted to get back at is this business. There's different ways of looking at it: 10%, 1%, 0.1%, 0.01%, but still. When you look at academia and the people that are doing well there, they're part of that top 10%, that sort of meritocracy that Thomas Frank talks about in his work, that has become the bulwark of the Democratic Party, that goes to work, that the Ivy League graduates that go to work on Wall Street, that have made money in finance. These people are all sort of sleeping in the same bed, and they want their sort of nice neoliberal world in which the 10% has gone from 30-35% of total income to 45-50% of total income, which is what has happened since 1980, which Piketty has documented in various ways over the last few years, and this is kind of a bubble that we're living in, that Eric Jacobson and obviously many others are living in, which doesn't get through to them how people are actually hurting, and they don't have to travel that far from the state streets to see who these people are.
There's an interesting development there that I think is now disappearing into the mists of the past, and only elderly academics recall any of this. But the situation in the American university in the years before and after Sputnik, before and after the Russian successes in the late 50s, has changed substantially in sort of 2 or 3 jumps in the years after that. There was tremendous support for education and academic and research in academic settings and so forth in the 1950s. The notion that that was part of the Cold War reorganization. It was military Keynesianism in a way, by dumping in money into programs at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where a young linguistics professor was working on questions that would go in the direction of machine translation. It happened to be Noam Chomsky. But Noam Chomsky's work on language, which made his reputation, was funded really by the Pentagon. For that. This was very popular. This was academia. And the best students in the Ivy League assumed their careers would be in academia, that they would go to graduate school and become professors, not just in technical subjects, but also in literary subjects. And so people like Chomsky, who was a scientist, of course, of the science of language, but also people who were doing things that were far removed from immediate military applications. The notion was you'd go to graduate school. The Ivy League changed quite remarkably in the years after the 60s, after the upsets of the 60s and so forth. Until that point, it was considered a falling off or a failure for an Ivy League graduate to go to law school. Law schools were looked down on. They were practitioners and so forth. You called them if you had a problem and you needed somebody to take care of it the same way you did with your secretary. Lawyers were not a big deal in the Ivy League at all. And people sort of said, well, what happened to so-and-so? Is he going to graduate school in California? No, he had to go to law school. Oh, too bad. Sorry to hear it. That was the view up through the 60s. But after that, the professional schools blossomed. For the next generation, Ivy League graduates wanted to go to professional schools, which meant medical school and law school, not to academic or scientific graduate schools at all. There was a real falling off there. And there was, another change after that when it became clear that other countries were subsidizing their graduate students, but America wasn't. And suddenly you were developing a generation of PhDs, of doctoral students, for whom there was no work. And there was another generation, a generation that roughly corresponded with the last decade or so of the 20th century. The triumph of neoliberalism meant that the graduates who in earlier years would have been going to graduate school and then to medical school and then looking for some other work left academia entirely and went to Wall Street. And there's at least a three-step version of that from the Second World War to the present. And what we get now, as you said, is a generation of Ivy League graduates who see their natural home to be on Wall Street. The result is, this is a result of the rise of neoliberalism, the turbocharged capitalism that gets underway in America in the 1980s, and the results are all around us.
So how does your critique of the supposed low status of the legal profession fit into the power of lawyers like the Dulles brothers and in the early Cold War era?
That's a good question.
Who were lawyers, and many of whom they're of the supposed movers, the Council on Foreign Relations and so forth, were connected with law firms. I realize they may have been well connected in other ways as well in terms of their inherited wealth, but.
I'm tempted to say these were the aggrieved losers who didn't get a professorship at Stanford, and therefore they had to go to Langley, Virginia, and overthrow the government. I'm not too far wrong there.
I'm not sure if that's a good answer, but
look at the people they were talking to who were professors at Stanford or Harvard or Yale or any place like that. I mean, I mean, what you're talking about here is the sources of the deep state. I mean, we've got to remember that in the years that I'm talking about, basically the last generation of the 20th century, what we now call outrageously, the intelligence community, and it's the CIA and so forth, was recruiting very heavily from Ivy League institutions, Princeton, Yale, Harvard, and their analogs on the West Coast, were the great recruiting grounds for the Central Intelligence Agency. The technical guys got into the NSA and so forth. You know, it was the Cold War once again that produced these institutions, and the institutions went to the traditional academic powerhouses to get their people. My best friend from secondary school went to Princeton, graduated in the mid-'60s, was immediately recruited by the CIA, and had a long and successful career in the CIA. But the reason he was recruited by the CIA was that he was first in his class at Princeton that year. We had plenty other examples of that same thing.
I have a feeling he's not still your best friend.
But
you know, if he is,
no,
that's fine.
I mean, the last time I saw him was at a 50th high school reunion. And we had a very pleasant conversation.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear it. Hopefully,
You're watching News from Neptune. It's his old home week, and the
well, let me just make one footnote to that,
sure.
because Paul Jay has been interviewing the historian Peter Kuznick this week, who has interviewed in the past, and who of course made made a series of films with Oliver Stone about America's untold history or untold story or whatever it was. And I'm not 100% on board, but it does make for some interesting and informative sort of alternative historical viewing. And what the theme of this series of interviews that he's doing with Paul Jay on The Real News is that the end of the New Deal, the beginning of the end of the New Deal, which they trace immediately to after World War II. They trace it really to the replacement of Vice President Henry Wallace in 1944 with Harry Truman, and the manner in which Harry Truman proceeded to get us involved in the Cold War and begin to sort of dismantle, even at a relatively early age, the era of the New Deal. The theme being that the New Deal is really on its deathbed now, because now they're going to be going after some of the major New Deal programs, Social Security, of course, and then the later 1960s program, Medicare. How successful that will be, remains to be seen. But what they're setting up this narrative that in which we can come to understand this backlash to the New Deal, to a certain extent, they argue, as having started with Roosevelt himself during his second term, in which he basically rescinded the New Deal programs, and then the economy in 1937 went into what was called the Roosevelt Depression, or the Roosevelt recession, and that sort of foretold, or was a foreshadowing of the reneging on the kind of social contract. What the Piketty work in Europe shows now, that European countries, the richer ones, have been able to limit their growing economic inequality to a certain extent and maintain their social programs and New Deal type social contract, their post-World War II social contract, to a much greater extent, especially Germany and France and even Britain, in relation to our own country. So anyway, we can, I guess, the narrative, the argument, the counterfactual history that Peter Kuznick has been arguing, he has for a long time argued about the replacement of Henry Wallace with Harry Truman. He pretty much asserts that if Henry Wallace had been vice president and become president, there wouldn't have been a Cold War. That's a pretty bold counterfactual, and the argument against that is that, well, the deep state gets its way, the ruling class gets its way, Henry Wallace, even if he had become president. I mean, and then you can get into conspiracy theories and so forth. But that's the argument that's being made, and at least you learn a lot about what was going on at that time by the manner in which he makes that.
There's a problem here that actually relates to what seemed to me to be terribly contemporary issues, and that is this problem of sorting out the source of government policy and the psychology, if you like, of government leaders, how those two are connected. And people say, well, if only Lincoln hadn't died, why the Reconstruction wouldn't have occurred. It's not, as you suggest, I think, that's not at all clear, because the way in which government policy gets shaped, we know, is not just a matter of whim, even in absolute monarchy. And whatever we want to say about the American president works within a system that we're concerned about in all sorts of ways right now, but it doesn't allow quite to say that the only thing we're talking about here is presidential character or something like that. I think there's in fact a liberal, and I use the word in a disparaging sense, is a liberal motif of trying to restrict questions of government policy to presidential psychology. What would Kennedy do? What should Kennedy have done? Kennedy was killed because of what he was planning to do. This is all nonsense, I think, without more significant evidence, but it gets the question wrong in the first place, because it says the only interesting question is the decision of a national leader, particularly a president, not the complex way in which a dominant social group that controls a government chooses policy. We're either reduced to saying the people who choose American policy are very stupid, or it's all in the hands of one man, and we got to convince them to get rid of Trump because he's too dumb to do it the way we want it done. I think both of these analyses suffer a great deal from not paying attention to how the policy of the United States actually does get formulated. There are others involved. It's a group. The group, actually, in many ways, the group we were talking about a moment ago, people who've been to best schools, are deeply involved here. But it's not a matter of mechanical reproduction of the wishes of an individual or of an accidental congeries of officials. Paying attention to how it happens is worthwhile. People don't want to do that, because if you start paying attention to how it happens, you very quickly run up to the question of whose interests are being served. Cui bono? What's being done here turns out to serve the interest of dominant social groups, and then we begin talking about classes, and we begin talking about material interests of various groups within that society that may be historically and fundamentally at odds. The history of all hitherto existing society becomes the history of class struggle, and that's a place we don't want to go. So we got to talk about presidential character instead.
Yeah. And well, the other thing to talk about, perhaps more profitably, is some, it isn't conspiratorial. It isn't a conspiratorial view of history to talk about Bretton Woods setting up the people who at Bretton Woods set up the global finance system in 1944. Was that 44 or so? Yeah, before 44. The end of World War II. Right. John Maynard Keynes, Harry Dexter White, and other people, other less well-known people, who basically set the template for the global economy that Panitch and Gindin talk about in their magisterial work about American global capitalism, or even, as other historians of neoliberalism have pointed to, the Mont Pelerin Society, which began with a meeting in Switzerland, as these things often do, and
those Swiss, not just the cheese. Come on,
people go to Switzerland to plot the next 100 years or so and how it's going to play off, because they get their privacy there, and and it's so scenic and everything.
It's
But
cold. You got to keep warm by plotting.
yeah, and they drink hot cocoa and they plot the world, how the world's gonna play out. But the historians of the manner in which neoliberalism has been thought about since the 1940s also point to the Mont Pelerin Society, and I think that's interesting to read about. There's a historian, oh gosh, his name is on. There's a well-known historian who I've been meaning, or philosopher really, who I've been meaning to mention on this program. I'll come up with his.
Mises?
Pardon?
Mises?
No, well, he was part of that. But someone who's Philip Mirowski, a guy who wrote "Never Let a Good Idea Go," "Never Let a Good Crisis Go to Waste," about what he calls the neoliberal thought collective. And it's kind of tough going, but it's kind of interesting to read. But yeah, anyway.
I'd like to bring this theme, this line, up to a contemporary moment and make it as self-serving as I possibly can. I have been pilloried in person and online for a couple of weeks now for apologizing for Trump, for pointing out that he is not the problem, that American war making is the problem, and that's a specification of the general question of government policy we were talking about a moment ago. I want to say at the outset that I don't consider myself to be apologizing for Trump. I didn't vote for him. I voted Green in that presidential election. But that I have thought that there were two important questions involved in the matter that we were being programmatically prevented from attending to, and I really think we should. The first question is the real nature of the hate Trump campaign and whose interests are served by it. Cui bono, once again, turns out to be the first question the historian wants to ask. Why is there such a hate Trump campaign? Why is there this campaign to remove Trump from office? The answer, I suggest, is the political establishment. We don't even have a good word for this right now. People speak of the deep state or the permanent government or something like that. I was doing it a moment ago when I was talking about their educational background and so forth. But there's still, it's still an amorphous notion. The notion political class was coined by Max Weber more than a century ago, and that's not quite what we mean when we speak of the deep state or the permanent government. In some ways, in recent time, it was summed up in the Clinton campaign. The deep state, the permanent government, included Pentagoners, good word, it seemed to me, to take in the military and the apparatchiki of the military, often from the law firms and so forth we were talking about. Pentagoners, neocons, neolibs, the spooks in the intelligence community. I realize that there are a lot of people, all these young people we end up talking to these days, David, who probably never even heard the word spook as meaning a spy in the way it did during the 60s. One talked about the CIA and the other, all those 16 intelligence agencies Mrs. Clinton told us about in the 60s as being populated by spooks. Okay, fine. There are other reasons. Probably the word was avoided, but it seems to me it's worthwhile to rescue that word in days of people like Mike Morrell. So the spooks in the intelligence community, and as we found in this last election, the senior members of the Republican and Democratic parties. There are perhaps people down the road in the Republican and Democratic parties who want to do the right thing, but that's not true of the leadership of the parties, as we know. So our deep state, our permanent government, is pretty well defined, and the people in whose interest that government is operating are also well defined. We speak of a capitalist ruling class, of a dominant social groups, interesting divisions within the groups that came up in this last election, but still in all, it's pretty clear we know who we're talking about. The first question then is why their interests are served by the hate Trump campaign. And that takes some conversation and a fair amount of paper to get clear, but I think we have to understand that
I'll be taking notes.
that the hate Trump campaign is not an accident. That there are interested, in the strict sense of the word, people behind the campaign, people for whom, to put it as sharply as I can, we're desperately afraid of Trump's attacks on neoconservative and neoliberal policies of previous administrations, and we're afraid that if he became president, he might actually act on those non-interventionist and populist economic themes. Well, in fact, in office, it's pretty clear he's been tamed or trained, both perhaps, to the neoliberal and neoconservative policies followed by the Obama administration and the Bush administration, and would have been followed perhaps more viciously by a Clinton administration. So the nature of the Trump campaign, of the hate Trump campaign, grew out of the notion that, my God, he might upset the apple cart on the part of the, or in the eyes of the ruling class, and that could not be allowed. Second question it raises is, why was Trump elected? And the answer, well, a year later, turns out to be very interesting and only, I think, partially paid attention to right now. Trump was elected because the electorate in significant numbers, sufficient numbers, rejected the pro-war and pro-Wall Street policies that he stood for, rejected the neoliberal and neoconservative principles that he criticized, and they elected him for it. Now, it's a long argument. We can talk about how that happened. We can look at those communities in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan that voted for Obama but didn't vote for Clinton, and the reason seems to be that their sons were coming home in boxes. These were the people that were the contributing soldiers to the Middle Eastern wars. Remarkable surveys on that showed how much that was true. The larger question, the immiseration of the American middle class, the recognition amongst American middle classes, amongst the American middle class, that the economic possibilities that their parents enjoyed were no longer going to be offered to them, and that their economic circumstances were going to be straightened, not expanded, as we had taken always to be the case in post-World War II America. The recognition on the part of Americans that their economic circumstances had been suppressed for 40 years, and that was going to continue, led finally to this inchoate outbreak of saying we've got to vote for someone who is speaking against that. The resulting confusion was very great. It was not a straightforward understanding of how the matter should work. But both these observations are open to all sorts of debate, but in some sense that's yesterday's history. The situation now was described, I thought, quite remarkably by the columnist Caitlin Johnstone this week in an article entitled "Anti-Trumpism is Anti-Progressivism in Disguise." When I say that anti-Trumpism is anti-progressivism in disguise, she writes, I don't mean to suggest that Trump is progressive in any way, shape, or form. Nor do I mean to suggest that his administration isn't advancing many legitimately toxic policies which must be ferociously opposed. I think she's quite right. By anti-Trumpism, I mean the blinkered, frenzied, oh my God, literally Hitler. I had to look up how oh my God works, but still.
I had the same thought when I read that.
That frenzied cult which prioritizes impeachment of the sitting president above all else and at any cost, and by anti-progressivism, I mean it's being used as a deliberate ploy to manipulate what remains of the American political left into the pro-neoliberalism, pro-war center. So you see where I was going with the first two questions. I think she's right about this. I think that's exactly what's happening, and I think it's not innocent. I think it's not an accident that it's happening that way. She writes, the campaign against Roy Moore was simply a microcosm of this general, quote, vote for us because we're not that scary boogeyman, good cop, bad cop game both parties have been extorting the American public with for generations. She's quite right about this. Like Trump, Moore was a scandal-saturated slob who represented some of the most pernicious aspects of the GOP, and though his opponent, Doug Jones, campaigned as a centrist who would work with Republicans, he was still viewed as better than Moore by enough people to win an election. This extortion scheme forced the people of Alabama to choose between a senator who would help move U.S. politics far to the right and someone who would help move U.S. politics only somewhat to the right. And they voted in self-defense, not because they liked Jones, but because they feared Moore. This is a perfect illustration of how anti-Trumpism is being used on a much larger scale. By constantly flogging the absurd narrative that Donald Trump is simultaneously A, crazy, B, stupid, C, a secret Nazi, and D, a treasonous Kremlin agent, the Democratic Party is able to herd the political left into supporting pro-war, pro-oligarchy candidates and agendas. In the same way they used, but Roy Moore, to win support for an imperialist corporate whore, they will use, but Trump, to win support for their neoliberal neoconservative extortion scheme at every turn. That disobliging reference to an imperialist corporate whore refers to the shining knight of the Alabama election, Mr. Jones. Whenever I point this out, I get a bunch of Democratic Party loyalists telling me, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can work to impeach Trump while advancing progressive causes. No, you can't. You can't and you don't. When it came time to fight the DNC's illicit charter-violating installation of Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders, they but-Trumped you into conforming. When it came time to support a third party, they but-Trumped you into conforming. She writes this stuff. I just get to perform.
Yeah.
When it came time to demand a massive overhaul of the DNC, they but-Trumped you into conforming. When it came time to demand a full investigation and restitution for the Democratic Party's misdeeds and manipulations exposed by WikiLeaks, they but-Trumped you into conforming. Every meaningful movement towards economic justice has been muted and marginalized since the election by but Trump, but Trump, but Trump, while the Republicans march the country further into corporatist oligarchy, and this scheme will continue for as long as it continues to work. As long as the American left allows fear of Trump to determine the way it thinks and votes, the American left will be completely neutered. When this boogeyman is out of office, they'll simply elevate another one, just like they did with Trump, probably one that's even scarier, since the last one was so effective. I think she means ineffective, quite frankly. If they can't beat that one, they'll use him to herd the left into the center, just like they're doing now. There's a pipe dream in the Dem-Enter school of thought. By Dem-Enter, she refers to the people who are saying, okay, in the current political situation, what we have to do is join the Democratic Party and turn it into something good. That's the Dem-Enter. It's like Brexit, Britain exit, so the Dem-Enter school. There's a pipe dream in the Dem-Enter school of thought that progressives will be able to stage a takeover of the Democratic Party beginning in 2018. But as long as the cult of anti-Trumpism, impeachment, and Russiagate continues to dominate the way Democrats think and vote, this simply will not happen. 2018 will not be a year in which Bernie-crats shore up influence over the Democratic Party. It will be a year in which Democrats are but Trumped into supporting the so-called center, which only gets to call itself that because its massive corporate funds and media influence have enabled it to become a mainstream force. You cannot have your impeachment Russiagate crusade and also move U.S. politics to the left, progressives. You cannot. What you are trying to do isn't like walking and chewing gum at the same time. It's like trying to walk in one direction while taking a jet plane in the other direction at the same time. Keep supporting the impeachment Russiagate narrative, and you're just handling the ranchers an easy day work as you march yourselves all straight into the slaughterhouse. They will, but Trump you into conformity until you stop letting fear and corporate narratives rule your minds and start pushing for what you truly want for yourselves instead. Caitlin Johnstone, I think on a high note.
Thank you for exercising your theatrical talents on Use of Neptune.
Limited as they may be.
I don't, in retrospect, in hindsight, the chance that anything that Trump genuinely had to offer the American working class seems to be getting increasingly small.
I don't disagree with that at all.
And I think what we're dealing with here, and this is something Paul Jay puts forth a lot on his approach to this on the Real News, is that there's divisions among the ruling class, but even given that Trump might represent a different part of the ruling class than that which preferred Hillary Clinton, it's clear that there's enough of the ruling class that's he doesn't have much experience with anything other than the ruling class. So that aside, I have been surprised by the manner in which they keep hammering on Trump's possible mental health issues, as well as his Diet Coke issues.
They may be connected,
The New York Times in the last few days had a long article about Trump's day and how he gets up and does his tweets. And usually I don't read stuff like that, but I am, sort of morbidly curious about how
But the
Trump,
New York Times is such a removed, objective account. You had to take it seriously, right?
Well, you got to get like 200 sources of little people who just have a little idea of what he does and put it all together into this is Trump's day. This is what he does from the time he gets up in the morning, and then how he does it, and along with the drinking a dozen Diet Cokes. I mean, if Obama drank a dozen Diet Cokes a day, nobody would think anything of it. They would say, "Oh, Obama, he could still hit 20-foot jump shots even with all those Diet Cokes." But with Trump, it contributes to this image of him as being just sort of on his last legs, and he eats all this fast food. And I mean, it does sound like his body is probably not in very good shape, and his mind is his mind. I don't know that his mind has changed all that much, except that he's just sort of taken his sort of business style, his sort of daily business style of getting up in the morning and doing deals, and really, I guess it kind of frightens the establishment in this country that he treats power in such a kind of trivial way, in such a kind of petty way, and it's kind of appalling on one hand, because you can do so much with all that power, but it isn't like he's really doing it. He's watching
This is
the news.
a crucial point.
He's watching CNN. He's watching Fox News.
Yeah,
he's getting worked up about the same thing that somebody living, just ordinary people who watch too much television get worked up about.
And while this is going on, policy is in the hands of the same neoliberal and neoconservative elements who've been running policy for 40 years. One reason why the concentration on Trump is so annoying is that he's probably the weakest president since Calvin Coolidge. He really doesn't do anything. He's turned the military over to a troika of generals, and he's turned the economy over to the former head of Goldman Sachs. Now, what do we got here? We got someone who is just fallen in with the same people who are running the economy and the war and committing great crimes with the economy and the war. He says, "Okay, guys, go to it." And all that talk about making America great again, which many Americans had heard as restoring the economic possibilities that their parents had and that they themselves had in earlier years, all of that has gone by the board because he's given over the economy and killing people abroad to people who've been doing it all along anyhow. And there's a peculiar development out of that, which is, once again, not innocent. It's a result of the hate Trump campaign. But that's an idealization of one of the greatest con men who have been president of the United States in a while, Barack Obama. And I had a nice paragraph from a friend of mine, a woman who lived in Yugoslavia during the Second World War and writes about the liberation of Europe by the Russian army. She publishes fascinating pieces on the website Counterpunch that we refer to frequently here.
Who is this?
Luciana Bone.
Okay.
Luciana Bone writes, "Oh my God, Trump is fornicating with that beautiful democracy Obama had left us. Wealth equality, love of immigrants, women and gays, peace on earth, milk and honey to even the poorest children, emptied the crowded jails, saved the environment, protected the parks, gave us health and core education. He was a dream, wasn't he? Oh, the nightmare of this fascist Trump, and all because people who vote are stupid." It's spelled that way, too. "And poor, and racist, and possibly they smell." She doesn't use the word deplorable, but you know where she's going. This idealization of the Obama administration came out this week in an interesting way. The quite righteous outrage at the abandonment of net neutrality centered on the chairman of the FCC who had been appointed by Trump. All the papers said they were wrong. He wasn't appointed by Trump. He was appointed by Obama. A majority of the commissioners of the FCC are Obama appointees, and they're the ones who voted to sack net neutrality. They have been reappointed, the chairman and one other perhaps, have been reappointed by Trump, but they're Obama appointees. So this whole notion of saying, look how terrible the Trump administration is, they've done this terrible thing to net neutrality, well, yeah, they have. And it's all part of the programs that the present administration inherits from the last administration, practically without change. The only change is the face on it, the way it looks. The smoothness of Barack Obama is replaced by the hairiness of Donald Trump. And the Hate Trump campaign is a successful attempt to make sure that policies don't change. War provocations against Russia and China continue. A massive and accelerating increase in inequality in the country at all, and continues at an accelerating rate. Everything is in order, and we have a weak president who's not going to change the sort of control of the American government that we've come to know and love so well in the last several presidential administrations.
And the quality of the debate about the tax bill reflects some of these problems also. So the question, again, as we've spoken before in this program, this question of how are you going to pay for it is always a false one.
Yes.
Because the federal government prints as much money as it wants to pay for whatever it wants, which is obvious whenever we go to war. But that aside, the question becomes not whether, of course, wealthy people and corporations shouldn't be getting more money or paying less taxes to give to wealthy people. That isn't going to result in any of the kind of structured economic growth and public investment that we so desperately need right now. But is the New York Times and the liberals and the Democrats arguing, instead of arguing against this tax cut, which they should argue, they simply should be arguing for example, keep taxes the way they are, but go another trillion or $1.5 trillion in debt over the next 10 years, which is what this whole debate is about. It's about 10 years, not about 1 year. But whatever it is, spend another $150 billion a year on the kind of public investment in infrastructure, in environmental concerns, all of these things. But that isn't what the Democrats are saying, and that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about Diet Cokes. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about Doug Jones or Roy Moore. We're not talking about any of these things, and there's really nothing that's being done that I can see in the mainstream media to clarify some of these points. And even, of course, to get my weekly skewer on Amy Goodman, she's not doing any of that either. She's interviewing mental health professionals about Donald Trump.
Whether Trump is crazy or not.
Yeah, right. So that just, it's frustrating that at a point which people could be being educated about the nature of the federal budget and what could be done about it, as well as the tax system, which is of course unfair, and it's unfair at the global level, state, federal, local. When you combine all those things, you see that most people are paying too much taxes and wealthy people aren't paying enough taxes. But once again, the federal budget reflects debt and deficit. There isn't anything wrong with that as long as the money that's being printed is used to put people to work and in various other constructive ways.
Well, we're talking about the outrageous tax bill that's in the Congress right now. We should mention that for local viewers, there is a rally this Saturday in downtown Urbana.
Tomorrow.
Which is tomorrow, yes, in downtown Urbana, 2 o'clock near the courthouse, the federal courthouse in Urbana. Urbana is small enough that if you turn up at 2 o'clock, you can see where the people are. But it's a rally against this tax bill that the Congress is putting through with the effective support of both parties. And that the Democrats have not done what they could do in order to stop it. Circumstances of the bill are such that some people have gone as far as to suggest that if Trump actually meant any of those things that said that got him votes on the economy, he'd veto the bill, because the bill is obviously not in the interest of the people who elected Donald Trump. And it's another example of the weakness of the Trump administration, that Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell are able to get this wretched bill through the Congress to the detriment of a majority of American citizens and to the vast enrichment of the 1%. Situation is clear. What's not clear is how we can break through these false narratives, the fake news that gives us an account of what's going on.
Not that there's any evidence that Trump ever considered for 1 second vetoing the bill.
We can talk about that. When it happens, I'll say I told you so.
Okay.
You've been watching News from Neptune.
I'll be happy to say you told me so.
For the 50th week of 2017. Presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green. Produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scollery. A media note here, since we're in the mood. There's a film at the Art Theater. 3 Billboards is the first part of the title, starring Frances McDormand, who looks like half of the most interesting women I've ever known. Go see that movie. It's the best movie of the year. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies and a good night to you.